Today I want to take a few minutes and talk a little bit about the concept of financial aid and support for students outside of tuition. Because as many of you realized as you looked at your own school's budget, that tuition in many cases accounts for about 85% of the income that's generated for the school. Now, in some cases, again, the additional income is derived from fundraising activities or from outside grants. But for the most part, you're looking at the tuition being central to your operations and the continued efficiency and effectiveness of your school. Now, one of the things that you also realize is that as you look at tuition, financial aid plays a big role. Now, people call it different things. Some will outright say, we're going to grant you financial aid, and that money is taken directly out of operations. There's no outside source of income. Now, in other cases, financial aid money comes from a pool of funds that is distributed by the archdiocese or by your local diocese. Now, what you will also find is that in some cases you will have merit-based scholarships that perhaps come from donations, established scholarships that your school has developed over a number of years. Now, one of the other things that often comes into play, and we don't call it financial aid, but it really is financial aid, and that is things like the discount for siblings. Many of you have tuition structures in your school where the first child, this is the tuition, and there's a reduced rate for the second child. The reality is that differential is really financial aid. The problem is a lot of schools don't count that in their financial aid money. But the reality is when you look at developing your school budget, you're assuming that everyone is paying the same amount of money. Now, you wind up deducting for things like financial aid. You wind up deducting for scholarships if you're taking it out of operations. Some of you have what they call legacy aid, where if your father or your mother or your aunt, uncle, cousin went there, that you get some kind of a discount. That discount is really financial aid. It always amazes me that schools are reluctant to call it financial aid. They also don't count those students in their numbers of children getting additional support from the institution. Now, one of the things that you also find is that in some cases, schools will look at financial aid as strictly an expense, and it is used as an expense if it is just coming out of your operating budget. That means you have no other source of income for financial aid. You're not getting it from the diocese. You're not getting it from any other source. In many cases, though, schools, when they have audits done, they have financial aid and scholarships as negative income. That's confusing to a lot of people. The reality is, it says you don't really have that income being generated, and as a result, you're just taking it off the top line. I've gone back and forth with accountants over the years. Many like to use that as a negative. I prefer to look at it as, okay, if we have income being generated, for instance, from an endowment account, from a scholarship account that was set up many years ago, bring that in as income from those accounts and then have whatever your expenses are as expenses. I think it's important for parents to understand that it is an expense. The same way as we look at the faculty discounts. So if a faculty member has a child, they perhaps get free tuition. Perhaps they get a 25% off or 50% off. That really is financial aid. No matter which way you want to market it, it's really financial aid. Now, why is that important? That's important because as you look at your chart of accounts and you start looking at your income sources and then your expenditures, you need to be realistic, because as the person who's ultimately charged with creating the school's budget, you need to understand what income is being generated on an annual basis and what your expenses are. I know that many schools have gotten into real trouble because of the fact that they kind of just say, well, we've got the extra space, so we're just not going to count those students who we kind of give a free ride to because it gets too messy. The reality is the budget should be the budget. It shouldn't be some hocus pocus type of situation where we try to make sure that we cover our tracks. No, it is what it is. That's the problem that we have. Now, in some cases, schools have gotten into trouble because they have given out more financial aid than they can actually afford. Hence, you run into deficits. And what do deficits lead to? Deficits lead eventually to the closure of an institution. Why? Because eventually you have to pay people, whether it's your vendors or your faculty. Failure to do that will put your institution in jeopardy. Now, when we look at our mission as Catholic schools, I've heard people over the years say, well, but, we have to take everybody in. Well, that's fine, and I fully understand and agree with that. But you, as the head of the institution, you need to make sure that you understand that your costs are still the same. The same way as, we have been trying over years to reduce the number of students in a classroom. In the old days when I was in school, we had 35, 40 students in each classroom. Now, if you put that many students in a classroom, people would be up in arms. People want 20, 25 as the absolute maximum. And there are research studies that show smaller classroom means more attention to the students and so forth. And as a result, that's a good thing. But the bottom line is you must figure out where you want your money to be spent. If you decide that you want to give out a lot of financial aid and you don't have that money coming from outside sources, the reality is that you are going to have to cut back on certain things. That might be faculty salaries. That might mean that you're not going to be able to upgrade your computer systems. That might mean that you're not going to be able to do the renovation that you need to do in the building. Again, remember the conversation of several weeks ago where we talked about the priorities, your vision as the head of the institution, and your mission, and how those two things mesh together. The challenge for you is to make sure that you understand where your sources of revenue are and where your level of acceptable spending is. I might want to buy a BMW, but my budget only says that I can have a Kia or a Fiat. The reality is, I might want something, but can I afford it? Too often, schools just assume that we're going to get X number of students in. And as you all know, what happens when the enrollment numbers do not meet the expectation? Many of you, as you were looking at your enrollment and tuition numbers, what did you find out? Your tuition kept going up. It didn't go down. For a number of you, your enrollment, instead of going up, was veering downward. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that if I don't have that tuition coming in, and that's accounting for 85% of my budget, how will I be able to hire all those teachers? And as you also realize, salaries and benefits. Salaries, most of you found out that they take up about 70 to 75% of your budget. And when you add in benefits and payroll taxes, that could add another 18% or 19%. So suddenly, you realize that the majority of your money is being spent on human capital. Next week, we're going to talk about compensation and salaries. So, why were we looking at financial aid and the budget distributions? We're looking at that because once we know where our expense centers are and what our income is going to be, we have to try to mesh those together. And you have to be realistic. So again, as you are thinking about the budget process, think about income from tuition, from outside sources, diocesan or archdiocesan grants, any kind of other grants that you might get, and what fundraising do you have going on in your school to cover that gap? Because most of you realize that if you took what your tuition really cost versus what you're actually spending, there is a discrepancy there. And your job as the head of the institution is to make that clear and also to figure out ways to cover those additional expenses and deal with creative ways to find new sources of revenue. Again, I hope these thoughts and comments help. As usual, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. Have a great week.